My mother wants me to give her my salary, and she'll give me half if I'm a good son. But my counteroffer was so good that now she has to find a job and a place to live. A few days ago, I had a rather uncomfortable conversation with my mother, and I still can't get everything she said out of my head. The thing is, she asked me to deposit my entire salary to her so she could manage it for me and give me half if I was a good son. Yes, you read that right. She wanted to have complete control over my money. And honestly, I don't know how we got to this point, but I guess I should start from the beginning. I was born and raised in a small town somewhere in the Midwest of the United States. I don't want to mention the exact name of the place because I know some of my coworkers are also on Reddit, and that would be too much of a coincidence. It's not that I'm ashamed of where I come from, but I don't like people knowing too much about my personal life, especially in a place like Reddit. What I can say is that I didn't have an easy childhood, though I don't complain too much because I managed to survive. My mother and father divorced when I was quite young. To be honest, I don't remember much of the time when we all lived together, but what little I do remember wasn't good. My father was never a great influence in my life, nor did he try too hard. He was a man who drank a lot and worked long hours, but he didn't even work in something I might have found interesting. I think he just used work as an excuse to not be home, and when he was home, he made no effort to spend time with me. What little I do remember of my father were moments when he was too tired or drunk to even pay attention to me. After the divorce, my mother and I moved into a small house. It wasn't much, but at least I had a roof over my head, and I didn't have to deal with my father's presence. Living with my mother was better than being with him, but it wasn't a perfect relationship either. She was never the most present or affectionate mother. I guess she always did what she could, but she was never like those mothers you see in movies, or the ones I saw that my friends had, who were always there to help with homework, attend games, or just hang out. My mother was more the kind of mother who was always busy with something or just emotionally absent. Sometimes, when I read stories on Reddit about other users' relationships with their mothers, I wondered if my experience was normal or if I just didn't get one of the good ones. Of course, in the stories where mothers are mothers and not completely insane. Despite everything, I managed to survive school. I was never very good at academics, and honestly, the idea of going to college was never on my list of priorities. I was more drawn to the idea of working, especially in something that allowed me to be outdoors. I think I was always more of that type, the kind who preferred to be on the move, using my hands rather than sitting behind a desk or in a classroom. While I was in high school, I worked several part-time jobs, saving what I could with the idea of one day getting out of that place. And that's exactly what I did as soon as I graduated. I saved up enough to buy a ticket to Alaska and didn't look back. Why Alaska? Well, Alaska has something special. There are jobs that not many people want to do, either because they're extremely tough or dangerous, but they pay well. And the best part for me is that many of those jobs allow you to be outdoors. I won't go into details about what exactly I do because, as I mentioned before, some of my coworkers are also on Reddit, and I prefer to stay anonymous. What I can say is that it's tough work, and it's not for everyone, but I enjoy it. I've never been one to shy away from getting my hands dirty or facing difficult conditions. In fact, I'd say I thrive in those environments. After moving to Alaska, I stayed in touch with my mother. We didn't have the best relationship, but I tried to call her every once in a while to see how she was doing. She did the same, although most of the time, it seemed like she only called when she needed something. At first, things were fine. She would call to catch up, tell me what was happening in the town, how her friends were doing, those kinds of things. But then came the requests for money. At first, it was small amounts, like $100 or $200, to cover rent or because she ran out of food before her next paycheck. I didn't mind helping her. After all, she's my mother. And although she wasn't the perfect mom, she raised me. So I felt like the least I could do was help her out once in a while. However, everything changed a few months ago. My mother met a man, and in no time he moved in with her. At first, she said it was a good deal because they would share expenses, and that would help her cover rent more easily. I didn't know this man, but I trusted that my mother knew what she was doing. I thought that if she was willing to let him move into her home, then he must be a good person. But it seems I was wrong, and so was she. After this man moved in, my mother started acting strangely. At first, she stopped asking me for money because supposedly he was helping her with expenses. But it didn't take long before she started asking for money again, and this time, much larger sums. She asked for $800 or $900, and there was always an excuse. The water heater broke, something in the house needed urgent repairs, things that couldn't wait until her next paycheck. At first, I believed her, but as the money requests became more frequent, I started to suspect something wasn't right. I told her no, not because I couldn't afford it, but because I didn't feel comfortable giving her that much money without a clear explanation. Besides, What happened to her new boyfriend? He was supposed to be helping her with the expenses, right? If that was the case, why did she need more money than ever? Every time I asked her, she gave me a different excuse, but it never made sense. As expected, after saying no several times, the calls started to dwindle. And when I called her, she was distant and cold, as if she was upset with me. In the end, I stopped calling too because it didn't seem like she wanted to talk to me. Everything came to a head last week. I got a call from my mother, and I thought that maybe after so long without talking, she finally wanted to reconcile, or at least have a normal conversation. But no, what she proposed was something I never imagined she'd say. She asked me to deposit my entire salary into her bank account, and she would give me half, but only if I was a good son. At first, I thought she was joking, but no, she was completely serious. She told me it was my duty as a son because she raised me, and that, besides, she was a better money manager than I was, that she knew how to handle finances better, and that way, she could make sure my money was used responsibly. I had never heard anything so absurd in my life. I told her no, obviously. There was no way I was going to deposit my salary into her account, much less give her half of my money just because she said so. I even offered her a compromise. I could give her some money every month, maybe $300, but I wasn't going to let her control my salary. In addition, living in Alaska isn't exactly cheap. Between the cost of living, supplies, and the occasional trips to town, I have my own expenses to cover. But no, that wasn't enough for her. She insisted it was my responsibility as her son to give her half of my salary, and that she knew how to manage it better than I did. I don't understand why she thinks I'm incapable of handling my own money. If I've managed to survive in Alaska, one of the most expensive and tough places to live, I don't think I'm that bad at financial management. I don't spend my money on parties or unnecessary things. All I do is work and save what I can. And now that I think about it, how can she claim to be a better money manager when she's constantly asking me for help to pay her bills? It doesn't make any sense. I think my mom has lost it. And trust me, I know what madness is like because being alone for days or weeks with only Moose around can make you lose your sanity a bit. But my mom's situation is even worse. I understand that she raised me, but asking me to deposit my salary into her account is absurd. So here I am, wondering if I'm the bad guy. But I don't mean by refusing to deposit my salary into her account, that's out of the question, but by helping her with something else. I understand that she raised me and all, but do I really owe her anything more than what I've already given her? Am I being a bad son for saying no? Honestly, I feel weird. On the one hand, she's my mom, and I think that as a son, I have some obligation to help her, especially if she really needs the money. But on the other hand, what she's asking for is unreasonable. I feel like she's trying to take advantage of me, and I don't want to give in to her demands just because she says so. I don't know what to think. What would you do in my place? Update 1. First of all, I want to thank everyone who commented on my previous post. I read all the responses, and I really appreciate the time you took to offer me your opinions and advice. I know I couldn't reply to all the comments, but I truly value what you said. Some comments helped me see things more clearly, and they reaffirmed what I already felt deep down, that I wasn't being selfish or a bad son for not giving in to my mom's demands. I want to clarify something that didn't seem clear last time. I wasn't considering, not for a second, the idea of depositing my salary into my mom's account. It's completely absurd, and I was surprised that some people thought I might be considering doing something like that. The reason I posted was to find out if I was wrong for not wanting to give her more money than I had already offered. Because, of course, she's my mom, and even though we don't have the best relationship, I do feel a certain obligation to help her as much as I can. But even that has a limit, and it's not fair for her to try to take advantage of me, especially when she's asking for irrational things. In fact, many of the comments helped me realize something I honestly needed to hear. I have no obligation to give my mother half of my salary, much less to deposit it into her account for her to manage. Yes, as a son, if I'm in a position to help my parents, I can do so, but it's not an obligation. Also, helping someone shouldn't come under unreasonable conditions or emotional manipulation, like what I've been experiencing with her. Now, putting aside the responses and advice I received, a few things have happened over the past few days. Particularly, I've been in contact with my mom again, but things haven't improved, to be honest. As I mentioned before, she had been angry with me for not agreeing to her requests, and we hadn't talked much after I told her I wouldn't deposit my salary into her account. However, a few days ago, I returned to the city after spending some time in a remote area, which kept me away from civilization, and from there, I was able to get in touch with her. The call wasn't what I expected. I don't know what I expected from that call, but certainly not what happened. As soon as we started talking, She told me her boyfriend had left her, and according to her, it was my fault. She explained that he expected that, with my financial help, she could stop working and stay home because, according to him, she was no longer young enough to be working all day. That statement left me perplexed. The first thing I thought was, why would someone who needs half of my salary to survive want to quit their job? I told my mom, and as expected, she didn't take it well. I mentioned that if she really needed that much money, it didn't make sense for her boyfriend to want her to quit working, and that maybe this guy wasn't the best person for her. Well, that was the spark that lit everything up. My mother got furious and accused me of criticizing her boyfriend without even knowing him. The next thing she said was that she was only trying to do what was best for him and for her, and that if I helped her more, she could have a more comfortable life after working so hard to give me a good life. For context, my mom is 48 years old. She's not an elderly woman who can't fend for herself, and what she was asking for simply didn't make sense. Also, using the excuse that she gave me a good life to justify that I should sacrifice financially was pure emotional manipulation. I can't deny that it affected me, but at the same time, I realized that this situation wasn't healthy, and as much as it hurt, I couldn't give in to her demands. Despite everything, I tried to reason with her. I told her this man was manipulating her and that she shouldn't quit her job because she'd lose her independence. But everything I said just made her angrier. She was totally willing to defend him no matter what I said. Finally, she accused me of being the cause of everything. She said her boyfriend had left her because of me, because I refused to help her financially the way she wanted, and she didn't stop there. She said that if I had been a good son, she would never have had to deal with these difficulties. She made it clear that all I needed to do was deposit my salary into her account, and everything would be fine. The worst part is, I'm not even sure if she was referring to her account or her boyfriend's. I tried to explain again that I couldn't do that I needed the money for myself, for my own expenses, and to live, but she didn't want to hear it anymore. I think what came next affected me the most. My mom, perhaps driven by anger, told me that she regretted raising me, that after everything she had done for me, I wasn't fulfilling my duty as a son, and now I was leaving her alone in her time of greatest need. But before I could react, she simply hung up the phone. Despite everything, there's a small part of me that sees something positive in this whole situation at least. Based on what she said, that guy has left her. That, at least, is something good, although I'm worried about what might happen now that she's alone. Update 2. It's been 2 months since I last wrote to you, and I have some important updates about what's been going on. I've thought a lot about what happened, and the advice I received from you. In the end, I decided it was time to address some unresolved issues, particularly with my mother, so I took a few days off and returned to my old city, partly to visit some friends and partly to see how my mother was doing. I hadn't heard much from her since our last encounter, and although we had spoken a couple of times, she hadn't asked for money again. That gave me some hope, so I decided it was time to make the trip. The first thing I did was book a hotel, because I wasn't sure how things would be at my mother's house, especially after everything that had happened between us. And though I didn't know it at the time, it was one of the best decisions I could have made. As I mentioned, I wanted to see some friends too, so I took the opportunity to plan a few meetings with them during my stay. Everything seemed pretty well organized, or so I thought. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, and after settling into the hotel, I decided the first thing would be to visit my mother. She didn't know I was coming, so I thought it would be a surprise. I wasn't expecting a grand welcome, considering how things were, but I at least hoped it would be a pleasant surprise. Either way, I decided to stop by her house, wait for her to come back from work, and say hello. When I got to the door and rang the bell, it wasn't my mother who opened it. It was her boyfriend, whom I hadn't had the chance to meet in person until that moment. Honestly, it wasn't the best first impression I could have imagined. Instead of a greeting or a welcome, the first thing out of his mouth was a cold and direct, "Who are you, and what do you want?" He just looked at me like I was an intruder. I explained that I was my mother's son, that I was visiting, and I saw how his expression barely changed. He didn't seem very excited to meet me. He shouted my mother's name, and when she appeared, it wasn't any better. Her expression wasn't one of pleasant surprise, but more of concern. She looked at me as if she didn't know how to react, and the first thing she asked was, "What are you doing here?" She didn't say it in a friendly way, nor like someone happy to see their son after so long. It seemed more like she was annoyed that I hadn't warned her in advance. I explained that I had decided to take a trip to visit her and see some friends, but I noticed she wasn't thrilled to see me. Instead of being happy, she seemed uncomfortable. The weirdest part was that they didn't even invite me inside. The entire interaction took place at the door, and her boyfriend was watching me the whole time with a hostile attitude. Then he decided to intervene and said, "If you have money to travel all the way here, you should have money so your poor mother doesn't have to work anymore." It was my first day off since I started working in Alaska, and they were throwing it in my face that I had spent my own money on a trip to visit my mother. I couldn't believe it. The worst part came when my mother said that maybe I had made the trip to give her money. At that moment, her boyfriend's eyes seemed to light up, as if he was waiting for me to confirm that idea. I stood there silent for a few seconds, processing everything that was happening, and finally responded that no, I was only there to visit. I also made it clear once again that I wasn't going to give her my salary, now or ever. But my mother didn't want to drop the subject. She insisted that if I hadn't come to give her money, then she didn't see the reason for me being there. That was the last straw for me. I told her that I hadn't seen her in person in years, and all I was getting from her was rejection, simply because I wasn't willing to give her the money she demanded. But her boyfriend wouldn't stop. He said that if I had been a good son to my mother, she would have invited me in without hesitation. At that point, my mother started with the same old speech, that if I were a good son, everything would be different. I told her that if I wasn't welcome in her home, then I'd leave. After all, I still had friends in the city who would be happy to see me and would probably invite me to have a good time without making me feel guilty about anything. So, I left. But before I could go, my mother ran after me. She told me that there was still time to do something nice for her, and that if I didn't want to deposit my salary into her account, I could at least transfer her half of the money once a month. I told her very clearly that I wasn't going to do that. I'm not sure if it was frustration or emotional exhaustion, but after saying that, I left without saying anything else. After that, I decided I wasn't going to let that encounter ruin my trip. I spent a few days in the city, visiting some friends and catching up with them. It was great to see them again, and although I couldn't see one of my best friends because he had commitments with his girlfriend, I managed to have a good time with the others. We went out for dinner, visited a bar to reminisce about old times, and overall, it was a very fun trip, regardless of what happened with my mother. So, that's the summary of what's happened recently. Update 3. My mother has definitively left her boyfriend, or rather, he left her, and he did it for another woman. How do I know? Well, because she sent me a long email, as usual, blaming me for everything. According to her, it's my fault that her boyfriend left for another woman and that her life is completely ruined now. I suppose when she says my fault, she's referring to the fact that I didn't agree to give her my salary and then sit around waiting for her immense generosity to give me a portion, if it wasn't too much to ask. Because, of course, according to her logic, if I had given her all my money, she would have been able to keep her man, and then, with her supposed generosity, she would give me a part of my own money. If I was a good son, of course. In the same email, she also mentioned that she had quit her job. Apparently, her boyfriend convinced her that working wasn't good for her, and now she says she has nothing. As for me, I decided not to respond to her. I'm tired of trying to be a good son to someone who never bothered to be a mother to me. I no longer feel like I owe her anything. I have my life, my dream job here in Alaska, and although it's not perfect, it's enough for me. Plus, every now and then, I get a visit from a moose. I can't be a good host to them, they could destroy my house, but I wave at them from afar, and they go on their way. Update 4. My mother has been left without a place to live. She hasn't been able to pay rent, and as expected, I received another one of her long emails where she blames me for everything that's happened. The good news, or what she considers the good news in quotes, is that she's gotten back together with her boyfriend. Although, if you ask me, I'm not sure it's good news for anyone except her. But I guess from her perspective, this is a victory since at least now she has a place to live. I don't know where her boyfriend found a place to stay, because from what little I knew of him, he was living with my mother. In the email, as usual, she starts by attacking me, accusing me of being a bad son for not supporting her. It doesn't even surprise me anymore, to be honest. In fact, I've started to take it with humor. I make myself a coffee, and every time she mentions that I'm a bad son, I take a sip. It's a little game, but by the time her email is finished, I've had all the caffeine I need for the day. It's not the most fun game in the world, but at least it keeps me entertained while I read her repeated complaints. The most surreal part of the email is when she mentions that her boyfriend is a real man, because according to her, he takes care of the people he loves instead of abandoning them. I had to read that twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Is she talking about the same man who left her for another woman? I'm pretty sure it's the same one, because later in the email, she confirms it. Apparently her boyfriend left the other woman because he realized he truly loved my mother. And that, according to my mother, is more important than anything else in the world. Even more important than having a son who, according to her, only thinks of himself. But the best part of the email, and I'm glad I kept reading before deleting it, is the ending. That's where she drops the real bomb. They're getting married. Yes, you read that right. My mother and her boyfriend, who recently abandoned her, have decided to get married. She even told me that she hoped I'd understand if I didn't get an invitation to the wedding, because in her words, I haven't done enough to earn a place in that special moment. I don't know if I should feel offended or relieved, but one thing is clear, I won't be sitting around waiting for an invitation. Update 5. I was unsure whether to write another update because the situation with my mother is so predictable that it's starting to feel like a never-ending loop. Her dynamic with this man is always the same. They fight, reconcile, fall in love again, and then, as expected, fight once more. The cycle repeats over and over, with no real change. And now, here we are again. I received another one of her emails which, to be honest, I find quite amusing. Someone asked me before why I receive emails from her instead of calls or messages. The reason is simple. I blocked her on my phone. So now she sends me these updates via email, which has become a kind of daily entertainment for me. In this latest email, she informs me that she's had to find a new place to stay and also a job. The reason, as you can imagine, is that her boyfriend left her again. This time, there aren't any scandalous details about whether it was for another woman or just because the lunar cycle indicated it was time. The only thing certain is that, knowing my mother, they'll probably be back together in a few months, in what will be the next round of this endless cycle. To be honest, I'm not sure if I'll keep updating this story. Although it may seem funny from the outside at times, the reality is that there aren't many changes in what happens. If something really big happens, I might write again, but for now, I think this will be my last update.